Yeah, so I'd love to introduce us. I'm Julius Musso. I'm the co-founder and CTO at MergeBase, which is an application security company focused specifically on the software supply chain. And then I'm really excited to have Jerry Hoff presenting today. And Jerry, he really looks at security at a much higher, broader vantage point than I do. So he's a very experienced security architect at NTT Group. And today he's going to give us his perspective on zero trust. So Jerry, with that, why don't you take it away?
All right, let's go ahead. First of all, thank you all for joining on this very pleasant day, at least where I am. It's a very, very nice day. I'm always about the cold weather, so I'm in a great mood. So very quickly about me, Julius, as you mentioned, I currently am the Group Senior Security Architect at NTT. For those of you who are not familiar with NTT, NTT is like the AT&T of Japan, one could say. It's a telecom. Obviously, it's the national telecom based in Japan, and then it has numerous operating companies underneath this kind of umbrella of NTT. Before that, I was head of security.
Oh, I was just going to say, we actually worked with a small NTT subsidiary in Victoria, BC. Here near our provincial capital, there's a consultancy group there that helps build and deliver software for the provincial government. Small subsidiary of NTT Group.
And so, Julius, any guesses on how many companies are within NTT?
Well, given that, there's a small group of like 100 engineers there building software for the provincial government in BC, I'm going to guess, at least 70. I know, that's my guess.
There's 1,000 companies within NTT.
Okay. Off by a factor.
They're pretty big, so.
Factor of 2 there.
At least, let's say legal companies. There's just quite a number of them. So.
Oh, I didn't mean.
I don't have them all.
Yeah, wow. I just did my math, factor of 2. No, I meant by order of magnitude. I'm off by like 2 orders of magnitude. Yeah, ridiculous.
We won't hold it against you.
Right. And so you're doing security architecture essentially to some degree for all 1,000 of these companies.
That would be. There's not that many hours in the day, right? So these companies are kind of organized into groups of companies. And so I helped kind of work with the security architects and heads of security on those top level companies, let's say. And then it kind of trickles down from there. So that's basically it. Trickle down, I guess the knowledge or the guidance or whatever trickles down, let's say. Sony, White Hat, Morgan Stanley, Aspect Security, Lehman Brothers. That's where I worked before, and master's in computer science from Washington University in St. Louis. All right, Julius, you ready to talk zero trust?
I'm ready. I've always been confused by zero trust. I'm mystified and confused. So I'm really looking forward to this.
So if you were mystified, we were going to demystify it to some degree. Let's talk about the core tenets of zero trust. And when you say, you may have been joking or not, but when you say you're mystified, most people really are mystified. It's not clear, I think. Zero trust it's not that difficult of a concept, but for whatever reason, it happened to get on the radar of like every tool vendor and solution provider on the planet, and everybody was kind of running around kind of defining it in a different way. So I'm going to try to keep this very simple. Let's talk about the core tenets. Let's talk about the key documents. Let's talk about what's the implication of application security, and then hopefully you're empowered at that point to read these documents and find out more.
Just before you dive in, though, I just just to be clear, it's not like trust nothing, right? That's not what zero trust means.
No, the word zero trust, it's a little bit of a misnomer, and people sometimes kind of look at it negatively from that. I'm assuming it's more like zero implicit trust. Trust needs to be earned, which we're going to get into in just a moment. It needs to be earned based on a set of data that would go into an overall calculation on whether or not you can believe a specific connection is valid or not.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Cool. All right, that said, This is just a big slide saying we still got a major security problem, right? Security problems just never seem to end. They just kind of get larger and larger as time goes on. We really need to make some type of a change. So this is the core to understanding zero trust kind of stems from this picture right here, right? So this is the old days. In the old days, you would go before COVID, right? You would literally go to an office. I know it seems like forever ago now, but you'd go to an office, you'd sit down, you'd log in with your computer from your work computer, and you would automatically have access to all sorts of stuff. You
There
might
might
have access
be,
to,
yeah, there'd be like a
go ahead,
little
Jason.
bit of network segmentation, right? But
It depends on the company. It
yeah,
depends on the company. It could be. Sometimes there's some network segmentation, but no matter what, you probably have access to certain things, right?
yeah.
File shares,
Oh,
obviously
yeah,
the
yeah. Oh, the
printers,
shared
this,
drive. Oh my goodness.
share drives, right? You probably have access to even reach the login page of various web applications that are hosted, let's say, internally to your organization. There's a whole
Mm.
bunch of implicit trust that you got just from logging in with your
Oh,
laptop on an IP address within your organization. Would you agree to that, or
someone.
what are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely.
All right, so going back to this was the old world, and guess what? That old world never really existed, just like all things that we fondly remember. It looks really more like this these days. You can't really argue. This is more or less what it looks like. This kind of pure, let me get my little pointer out. This kind of like pure border that we thought that we had in the past didn't really exist because we have all sorts of connections in and out of a large network. In fact, you can almost feel that the larger your network, the closer it is to a public internet. There's some way that
Hmm.
attackers can get in there and so forth. There's inbound connections, outbound connections. It's very, very hard to keep track of what's going on, especially when the network just keeps growing larger and larger. Plus, folks at home, they are maybe connecting to a VPN potentially. Not all, or some organizations are actually moving away from VPNs, to be honest, and we can get into that later. But I think it's almost, yeah, for most organizations, it is the case that if you're working from home, you probably have a direct connection to Salesforce, to Office 365, to some things that are in Azure, some things that are in AWS. So you now have this bifurcated set of traffic, and you might not, you as the security team in your company may have very little visibility on what these users are actually connecting to if they're making a direct connection to some kind of a cloud-based service. Plus, if they have identities in these cloud-based services, that really means that that identity needs to be protected because that is literally your main security control of keeping people out, for example, of like a file share repository in the cloud, like Dropbox or OneDrive or whatever. That username password pair might be the literally only security control you have to keep the bad guys out, if that makes sense. Julius, what are your thoughts?
Oh, it really reminds me of the Struts, the Equifax disaster in 2017, or yeah, that's 2017. That's right. Yeah, where, they sort of moving laterally, they discovered, I think a file share or something. I'd have to go read the congressional report again. And then on that file share, essentially, was a configuration file that had the host names and IP addresses and usernames and passwords for every database run by Equifax.
Mm, mm.
So it's a
Very
very,
scary.
yeah, and so very similar sort of situation where, oh, we have a config file and the network, once you're in, you're in. So you can just reach, every production database within our organization because the network's completely, internally available. And oh, look, and for convenience, engineers had put together a very nice config file so that all systems could connect to databases as they needed. And then the bad guys found that config file.
Exactly. That's a very, very good point. I see a couple folks are off mute. If anybody has any comments in the chat room, chat away. Nope. All right. So moving to the next slide, I think a lot of these issues we've just discussed, right? This idea that we thought that people and devices that are inside the perimeter are good, people outside the perimeter are not good. That perimeter has really kind of fallen by the wayside. Important assets are assumed to be within the perimeter. It cannot be assumed, right? If you're
Hmm.
using Microsoft 365, there's most likely a lot of very sensitive documents that are living inside of Office 365 or Dropbox or Salesforce or whatever it happens to be.
Have you clicked next slide? I'm not seeing the.
Oh, let's see here. Your screen sharing is now paused. Who paused it? What happened?
Oh,
Let's see. All right, can you see it now?
yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. All right. So yeah, trust-based people and devices within the perimeter are good. We already talked about that. Important assets are assumed to be within the perimeter, no longer the case. Cloud access or resources are unmanaged or user managed. Well, unfortunately, when we all had a mad scramble that people were working from home, that probably was the case. Access is usually overly permissive.
Mm-hmm.
Authentication is usually point in time.
Except the Zoom chat permission. That one's overly restrictive.
Yeah, well, that's good. You want it to be overly restricted. You want to make sure that you are consciously giving
Of who's
access
allowed
to
to
that.
chat, yeah.
Yeah. Authentication point in time, single factor. Connections are often unencrypted, especially within internal organizations, or let's say internal web applications
Oh,
within
yeah,
an
the internal,
organization.
yeah, the back-end connections often, yeah. Well,
Totally.
APIs talking to each other in the back end, yeah, often that wasn't encrypted.
Exactly. Inconsistent security applied. So if you don't have a single point of where these security decisions and access control decisions are being made, it's probably very inconsistent, and then very limited logging and visibility. So these were the issues in the bad old days.
So I have a confession to make, slightly
Confess. Julius,
embarrassing
confess.
confession if you go back a slide. So at MergeBase, we're a relatively small startup, right? We have, I think, just under 10 staff. And so we haven't actually bothered to deploy a VPN, right? I was wondering your thoughts on that. I mean, it's, in a way, if you take a zero trust model towards your systems and your security architecture, you don't really need a VPN. That's what I'm hoping you'll agree.
So VPNs are now kind of falling by the wayside, to be honest. So what most folks are doing I mean, I wouldn't say most, but there is a trend where assets that you might have had within a specific, let's say within a closed network, right, within your corporate network, for example, most of it or a lot of it is moving outside into the cloud anyway, right? File
Mm,
shares are now going to be cloud-based. Office
mm.
365 can be accessed by the cloud. You don't need to go through a VPN. Internal web applications, and then we're going to talk about this in a moment, you see a trend of them being exposed externally, right? Which actually increases the need for security in those web applications, because I think we all know if you build an application for internal use, you normally think, well, it's internal use only. We don't have to do much security. That was always a flawed assumption. But now that
Mm.
these things are being exposed externally, that's even more of an issue. However, you can put put some put some controls around there so that even access to the login page might need to require some bit of authentication or something along those lines before somebody can even reach it. Access control and authentication. So we can talk about that, but yeah, the whole need for a VPN, from what I can see, seems to be diminishing.
Okay, I feel
So
reassured. I
you
feel
guys
reassured.
never deployed a VPN, and maybe you kind of never need to.
Oh, nice.
In September 14th, 2010, so 12 years ago, this gentleman, John Kinderberg, he put out this specific document that kind of changed the world in security. No more Chewy centers, introducing zero trust model of information security. And he basically proposes a system that, or let's say a philosophy of design that eliminates or reduces a lot of those risks that we had in the past. So the whole idea that before we had a very hard shell or crunchy outside and a chewy soft center, he says that really doesn't fly. And that was back in 2010. Post COVID, it really doesn't apply now that you have so much more of a workforce working from home and you have such a large degree of cloud-based assets that are being accessed. His vision actually for the need of something like zero trust has played out spectacularly well. So let's talk about zero trust, the concept. It's really a term for an evolving set of security paradigms that move defenses instead of static network-based perimeters, and it focuses on users, assets, and resources. That's how we look at the world, not on what's inside the network and what's outside the network. It's more of user, asset, resource. All right, so this user, assets, and resources, you're really looking at the user, and how do you know that if the user is legitimate or not? It boils down to their identity and identity, proof of identity. So that becomes a major, major concept within zero trust. And then understanding the asset that they're trying to connect to and the resource they're trying to connect to, you need to make sure that that is explicitly granted and is legitimate, and is monitored. So those are and is secure, right? And is encrypted. So those are kind of those fundamental concepts that are all wrapped up in the zero trust. So this is the actual definition. And this is from the NIST Special Publications 800-207. Sorry, my mouse is going over. I'm kind of moving windows around that probably are invisible to you. But zero trust provides a collection of concepts and ideas designed to minimize uncertainty in enforcing accurate, least privilege, per request access decisions in information systems and services. So very high level, but it covers those exact topics that we've just been discussing.
I'm going to open it up to the floor a little there. Just is anyone familiar with zero trust here on the call? Is anyone does that definition resonate for you, for everyone on the call? Danielle's saying yes, familiar with zero trust, I assume, and that this definition resonates. Would anyone, I guess, have anything to add to this definition? For me, I'll just dive in then. It's kind of about there was a lot of assumptions. I remember back in the day of internal network versus external network, outsiders and insiders. There was just sort of this baked in assumption that the insiders are good, safe, doing the right thing, right? And it made it easier to reason about your security because you've just divided it into basically who's on the outside, who's on the inside. So, I really, and then a lot of focus was put on that perimeter. Like we had these RSA secure ID things where the number would change every 60 seconds. That felt like that was wow, really super secure to breach, to get in through that outer shield. But whereas I feel like the zero trust to me is saying, well, you need to really look at your assumptions here, and you really need to establish way more defense in depth in a way. Defense needs to be everywhere, not just at this outsiders,
it
insiders.
Does, but just think about the growth of cloud-based services and things like that. In that old model, I mean, if you just take these things one at a time, how do you protect those assets that are cloud-based, right? If you're really just focused on your own perimeter, right?
Yeah, they're not even inside anymore. What do you even do about them at all?
Right? And then let's say you've got malware, you've got malicious actors that manage to get inside. Now they can move around anywhere they want to go because you don't really have any security controls internally, potentially.
Arvind has a comment here that honestly, as an application security developer myself, and as an application, I'm a hands-on application level software engineer. That's what I've been for 2 years now. Per request is too much, but running zero trust per session establishment, I can see that being how it probably works under the hood in a lot of situations, right?
So let's make sure that when we talk about requests, we're not talking about HTTP request response paradigm. What we're talking about is a request to an asset, right? But you do have this idea of continuous reevaluation of authentication and access control, and that normally is not implemented at the application level. It's normally a separate system that's running that's actually overviewing what connections what connections exist. And is there anything fundamentally that's changed about those connections that would cause you to reevaluate from a security point of view the situation, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then to make it line up with what you're saying, like in a way, a session with a an online system that you need to use, that is essentially an asset and a user pairing, right? Like I need to use this resource for a while. That's a session. Well, that's being evaluated then, yeah. But per
Yeah,
HTTP
and
request, yeah.
well, so if you look at, so yeah, it can get granular, but right now what we're discussing is kind of at a higher level. I need to
Okay,
access this web application. That's my asset I'm trying to get to.
yeah.
Now, to get deeper into the application and say, well, is that person supposed to be using the administration functions? Zero trust doesn't normally, in its normal
Mm,
definition, get down to that level. But you can take the zero trust concepts and apply them in your application, because no matter what application you have, you've got your own access control and so forth that's built into the application itself. So you could apply these. But when we talk about like the major pieces of zero trust, as far as I at least, let's say at the initial level that you're starting with, you're probably going to have some kind of an identity provider. You're going to have some mechanism for access control. But by access control, it just means can you connect to it or not, let's
mm,
say. It
okay.
doesn't necessarily get into the details of the application.
And then Danielle has added her definition here, a security framework requiring all users, whether in or outside the organization's network, to be authenticated, authorized, continuously validated for security configuration and posture before being granted or keeping access to applications. That perfectly aligns with what you've been saying, Jerry. So thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Danielle. All right, moving on. Moving on. This picture comes from the special publication NIST 800-207, which I strongly recommend everybody download and read. It's a very kind of landmark document in the world of zero trust. But you can see here, you've got a subject using a system, going through some type of a policy enforcement point before they can access some type of an enterprise resource. And that policy enforcement point goes back to this policy decision point using a policy engine and a policy administrator to decide whether or not this connection should be allowed or not. And it's not just looking at username password pair, it's looking at threat intelligence, activity logs, it's looking at device data, it's looking at access policy. It might, if we get down to the device data, it might make sure that your device isn't infected with malware. So you might actually be taking data from your XDR, EDR solution on your endpoint. So the modern day antivirus that might actually be feeding into your authentication system to say, hey, is this thing infected or not, right? You might be pulling data. Is this machine patched or not? That type of information traditionally is not involved in an authentication process. But in zero trust, all of these pieces of data would go into an overall engine here that decides whether or not to allow that authentication and access to occur.
From an academic point of view, I really appreciate this slide. Like this looks like a very solid design, a solid, theory of zero trust. But surely, like I guess I've been in this industry long enough to be like, one, I'm gonna bet like a lot of vendors claim to fully implement this to the most magical, amazing degree ever, and that second, that the implementations probably leave a lot to be desired.
I'd say it takes a village of vendors, right? So there's no one
village. That's awesome. That's so awesome.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you're going to have there's multiple big components that are most likely going to be supplied to you by vendors that are going to give you the major pieces of this. But one of the features in zero trust is you don't have this whole concept before. You had discrete systems, right? You can make it through one gate, and now let's see if we can make it through the other gate. Yeah. Now the gates are all talking to each other, right? Yeah. So the modern day antivirus, your EDR, XDR solution is probably talking to your authentication provider, right? And it has a feed into the authentication. The access control is getting data. You might be pulling data off of the machine, some type of configuration data that's being fed into this whole thing. It's being continuously reevaluated. So like all the security guards are talking to each other in this kind of new paradigm, if that makes sense.
Okay. It sounds like it's also probably an area that is advancing rapidly.
Yes, yes. And it's something that takes it takes a non-trivial amount of time to implement. And it's definitely one of those things that you phase in over time. It's not something that like, okay, let's implement it over the weekend. Or no.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
it
Oh,
took,
and
for
then
example, it took Google. I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead. You go ahead.
I was going to say when Google implemented their version of Zero Trust, it took about 8 years, right?
Oh my goodness.
As an example, so this is like
Um,
5 to 10 year effort.
Another problem I imagine is you could bring this in, right, and roll this out in your organization, and boom, next thing you know, like nobody can get any work done because they're just being blocked and denied, like across the board.
Yeah, well, that's always the worst case scenario. Let's say in security, that you overzealously lock everything down to the point where nobody can do anything, right? So the extreme example of that is, hey, unplug the data center. We're secure now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
nobody can do any work. But yeah, you don't want a denial of service yourself. So normally what you do is you have phases where you have some kind of like listening phase, right? And then start implementing and incrementing the security rules stricter and stricter as you can make sure that you're not breaking anything. That's normally how it goes.
Okay. And as you're rolling out training, I guess, to staff, etc.
Right. Right. All right. Shall we move to the next slide?
Yeah, let's move on.
All right. So this effectively means strong authentication, strong identity is really paramount, right? Again, if you have cloud-based systems like we talked about before, Azure, AWS, Salesforce, whatever it happens to be, Box, Office 365, or now what they call Microsoft 365, authentication and your identity is really that major security control that you need to rely on to keep the bad guys out. Access control for all connections, encryption of all connections, consistency of rules, device control and inspection, deliberate access granting, and enriched monitoring. So hopefully that kind of fixes the set of issues that we talked about before.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So I think everybody should be familiar with this. If you're not, definitely go read this immediately. Like just disconnect from this webinar right now. Just go read this.
I mean, yeah, this was a big executive order for us, for MergeBase in the SCA space, of course, because it references a softer supply chain. But I was kind of surprised to see that it also references zero trust, as you're saying.
Zero trust architecture multiple times and basically says that zero trust architecture and, architecture, okay, that's fine. Zero trust architecture really needs to be implemented across all the agencies within the United States government, which generally, given the size of the United States government, has a ripple effect out to vendors and vendors of vendors and so forth. So it really becomes mainstream at this point. So you can see here that it actually says that it needs to be, in alignment with zero trust architecture, I believe, to sell to the federal government. And their version of zero trust is based on that NIST document that I told everybody to go out and read if you haven't read already. Yep. And as you mentioned, Julius, SBOM, software bill of materials is highly mentioned in here as well. So you start to see these kind of twins that get referenced frequently, which is zero trust and then application security. Mm-hmm. And it started here with SBOM, and it's actually growing, as I'm going to mention in just a moment.
I like that how you keep coming back to documents. I go to a lot of presentations, a lot of webinars, etc., and I just don't see people asking me to read stuff. So this is different.
Well, hopefully that's okay. I think here's why I think it's important. I spent in very large organizations where I've spent a sizable percentage of my career. It's in order to build a case, especially if you're getting budget and so forth, you really need to make sure you build it on a very solid foundation. If you're in a smaller organization, you could just say, hey, my experience tells me this is what we need to do, right? If you're in a very large organization and you're asking for millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of dollars of budget, you really need to make sure that your ask is based on extremely solid footing, because it will be challenged. And so going back to NIST documentation, going back to industry standards documentation to make sure that you're formulating your case appropriately and that your thinking is well versed. I don't see any harm in it. But you're right. Not everybody goes back to all these NIST and governmental documents, but I think in the future you're going to have to, because like this presidential order is referencing these NIST documents as an example, right?
Well, I honestly, I think that's actually a powerful takeaway for myself and for everyone who's here today is like, there's these incredible resources, these incredible documents that, like probably only take a few hours to read through effectively, and that are really going to enrich your own understanding on security and how to secure your own organization.
Julius, that could actually be a presentation as well, like NIST, like top 10 documents.
Oh
that
yeah,
you
yeah,
need
yeah,
to
yeah,
read.
yeah. How to like authentically like power up your own security program and your own security knowledge. Yeah.
Oh yeah, a lot of this stuff used to be arcane. You had to, go to different security conferences to kind of glean this type of information. Now these things are being codified and documented. So, I mean, I've mentioned these NIST documents. We haven't even talked about like the NIST cybersecurity framework or some of these other giant, documents that I honestly like. I would promise you that most organizations that have a CISO most likely are using the NIST cybersecurity framework as the basis of their security program. Right. We're not talking about that in this presentation, but that's another NIST document that I highly recommend.
Nice.
Add that to the reading list. All right. So here is the document we've been talking about, 800-207, Zero Trust Architecture. And there's a more kind of maybe a little bit more approachable, user-friendly document put out by CISA. And if you're not, Julius, you're probably familiar with CISA,
Oh
right?
yeah,
The governmental agency, right? For I don't remember it's an agency. I don't even remember exactly the hierarchy of agencies within the U.S. federal government, but it's essentially an organization within the U.S. federal government that deals with cybersecurity issues. And I'm very impressed on what they do. I actually get daily updates just from Google, like Google Alerts. I always want to keep up what CISA is putting out, but they do a very good job of putting out information to the public and documentation. And in this case, they have this zero trust maturity model. So if you just search for CISA zero trust maturity model, here's the link down here below. This gives you, again, this is very high level, so your organization might need to take this as inspiration and then build on top of it. But it tries to show you some basic pillars of zero trust. You can see here identity, device, network, application workload, and data as these fundamental pillars. And it kind of helps to give you a path of traditional, like where you might be currently, advanced, implementing zero trust, and then optimal, more in-depth or optimized zero trust. Yeah. So it's not probably detailed enough for like it's not like a Gantt chart, but it definitely can be something that gives you inspiration. All right. So far, so good. Julius, any thoughts?
Just staring at these 5 pillars here. Oh, it's interesting. A traditional at the top, data not well inventoried. Well, yeah, guilty.
I mean, it's really, if you're talking about, and to be honest, most applications are not well inventoried, right?
Yeah.
If you go to most organizations, like how many web applications do you have? We don't know. How many APIs do you have? We don't know, right? How many domains do you have? We don't know, right? So yeah, now imagine the data that's inside of those applications, plus the data that's on your laptops, plus the data that's on your servers. No, nobody inventories that as far as I know. Yeah. I mean, some organizations might if they're very small, but large organizations that have been around for decades are going to have just a sprawl of data and applications and even networks and even data centers in some cases that are all over the place.
Oh, and just to clarify, by the way, I'm talking about like our internal shared drive and our internal like legal documents, the patent documents, just stuff like that is sort of a bit scattered. Our actual inventory of our customer data is actually very tightly controlled and very well inventoried. So I just
Good.
want to give out that misconception that we're mixing a big pot of melting customer data. Not at all the case with us.
Very good. All right. Any other thoughts on this slide? Should we move to the next?
Sure.
All right. Any questions from the audience, actually? Going twice.
Inga, are apps like Slack and HubSpot part of the Zero Trust ecosystem? Oh, absolutely. Oh, Slack is just hilariously cross-cutting, isn't it?
Totally.
As you're seeing, kind of interesting take on that in terms of like how important or is the data on Slack, because Slack stores every chat forever. And the excited mins can access all chats on Slack, including all private chats. So apparently right now at Twitter, for example, staff are being terminated because they were expressing negative thoughts about their new owner in private chats, not even on public chats, just even private one-to-one chats with their colleagues saying, oh, I'm not really a big fan of our new owner. The staff getting terminated from that.
Yeah, that's a different use case altogether, I guess. That could be another webinar, right? How to make sure that you don't inadvertently get fired based on
data that you created. Yeah. Okay, and Arvind is mentioning organizations have given permissions for their development testing teams to spin instances. So how can we apply Zero Trust in development and testing environments? Yeah, I mean, certainly.
Go ahead.
Oh, just out of the gates, I'm thinking, well, I mean, you do have that a very common practice now where there's no production data is allowed in development and testing. Of course, as a software engineer myself, I know that tantalizing, oh, if only I had the production data, then I could recreate this production bug so much easier. So you just honestly have to be very disciplined about that. You're like, no, I'm not going to take a copy of the prod database, right?
Yeah, and that's not even Zero Trust. That's just like common sense, right? Don't use production data in a development environment. But some of the Zero Trust principles that could be applied here would be this. How many folks out there, this is a rhetorical question, but if you use Google or search engines in a good way, or not in a good way, but in an interesting way, or if you use attack surface management tool, you can find test environments all over the web, right? Julius, you've seen this 100 times.
Oh, yeah.
Test environments accessible. So clearly that's a violation of Zero Trust, right? That's a violation of the principle of least privilege, which is a key part of Zero Trust, right? And then if you can get to those, if you can authenticate into them, if you could put in like admin, test, or whatever, it compounds of where Zero Trust would have been helpful. Now, if you...
I was just going to say, who told you my password?
Saw it on a movie called Spaceballs. So yeah, if you think about Zero Trust development environments, now I don't know that there is an actual thing like Zero Trust development environments, but the way that I might implement this is I might create within, and I'm assuming your development environments, let's just take an example. Let's say it's in a cloud service, right? You've got it in Azure, you got it in AWS. You can create environments, and actually you can pre-create environments at the administration level that say testing environments do not allow any connections except for, you give some very specific criteria, right? You still need to authenticate, let's say in your authentication provider, that's same everything else. You get to the testing environment. Maybe you can only get to the testing environment with certain credentials, but you can kind of lock it down so it's, at a minimum, it's never openly accessible. But at a default level, it should probably be extremely restricted so that only the developers that are working on it and maybe the QA staff can reach it.
I mean, and certainly I would imagine like in a larger organization, a very well-resourced organization, perhaps like yours, Jerry, the development instances and the test instances could plug into that zero trust evaluation engine.
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That engine should be in front of all of these types of assets. So if you've got some cloud-based assets you're trying to access and you're a developer, even if it's a test environment, why wouldn't you have them go through the authentication process? I mean, there could be some rare cases you're trying to test out the authentication system for your users, right? It needs to be publicly exposed and so forth, but that would be done on a case-by-case basis. But these principles of ensuring that identity is paramount, you know who's connecting, they have the privileges to connect, etc. I mean, that's all falls within, and you know, the connection is encrypted. That's all goes under the zero trust rubric. And then under the secure coding rubric, don't use production data in a development, you know, test environment. Make sure you don't have any credentials and other, you know, sensitive data that's hard coded within your source code. You know, blah blah blah. All the other kind of OWASP top 10s plus all the best practices would go into that, you know, that environment.
And then just from a security, not for security, actually just from a software engineering best practice, prod and dev and test all being essentially identical environments that are, you know, equivalently configured. That's a best practice for software engineering too. So like if prod already is plugged into the zero trust engine, then you probably want dev and test to be as well, just for pure replicability. I can't say that word, replicability.
Yeah, I think that's the correct pronunciation. Yeah, and you know, this is another thing that we could have at a webinar in a future date. So if you've got, you normally don't have one testing environment, and unless you're a very, very tiny company, you normally have hundreds of testing environments, right? Mm-hmm. Hundreds of development environments, hundreds or thousands of production, you know, assets that are out there. So if those are, let's say as an example, those are hosted in a single cloud provider, AWS, Azure, take your pick, I guess Google. So you can actually create landing zones and similar things at the administration level. So you can say, whenever you press this one button to create a testing environment, but testing environments will always have these features, right? They cannot be accessed by, you know, from outside the internet, you know, at large. You have to go through, you know, these mechanisms to authenticate to it, et cetera, et cetera. But you can actually set that up administratively at a higher level so that it's easier on the development team when they need to create these things, but you get the security controls and security restrictions kind of built in so that they don't have to, you know, manually make sure, oh yeah, we forgot, we got to turn this off, we got to turn that off. It can be, you can find that happy medium where it's secure and it's easy on the staff, potentially, until they want to do something custom, and then it's a little wanky there.
No, great discussion.
All right, by the way, Julius, time check. How are we doing on time?
I'd say we have like 10 minutes. Yeah.
All right. Good. Well, let's go a little
further. I want to just shout out to the participants today, everyone that's attending. You guys are really, you know, making this much more interactive, like really appreciating your comments and your chats. So it just makes it more fun for us too. So thank you.
Totally. And I don't know if you've been looking at the participant numbers, but normally you get a drop off of participants over time. We're actually increasing.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. Yeah. Very good. All right. So
hey Julius.
Oh, Shannon.
So all this trust, you know, I mean, a lot of this, it's great to have this overview of zero trust. You know, it's definitely important. I think of zero trust also kind of in a wider frame, or, you know, kind of like how you were alluding to it in some respects of the fact, like, you know, with merge-based runtime protection, for instance, right? You have the ability to not just, you know, monitor or block, you know, libraries or functions that you know are vulnerable and have exploits out on them, but you also have the ability to, you know, basically do a least privileged kind of zero trust attitude to your, you know, to your applications, and basically monitor them, find out which libraries and functions are actually being used, and then just turn all the rest of them off and block it, right? You have zero trust for anything that you don't know that's needed. Is that, do you feel like that's a zero trust model there for application, you know, hardening?
Yeah, absolutely, right. Because if you look at zero trust as essentially, let's bring as much context as we can into our decisioning around access, right? And allowing these things to happen, allowing certain actions across your infrastructure. So the merge-based runtime protection a- absolutely is a deepening of that context, right? Adding more information to that context. Uh, and
I feel
that's
like there's two ways to use runtime protection. One is the reactive way. Oh no, there's a CV on Java or struts, or log4j, and now I need to block that or monitor it. But there's also a proactive way, which I would consider really a zero trust model of using runtime protection, which is basically to turn off any library or any Java function that's not actively being used by your application until somebody screams for it to be turned back on.
I think it's definitely a sensible application of zero trust approaches. I don't think any of the zero trust documents, like these NIST documents that Jerry's referencing, would currently would talk about something like that. But I think it's a very sensible application of the philosophy.
Totally. And so part of zero trust, so Shannon, that's a great comment. And part of zero trust is this principle of least privilege, right? Which is a security axiom that we've always talked about, which is if something doesn't need to be turned on, if something doesn't need to be there, if something doesn't need to have access, turn it off, right? That's a fundamental of hardening.
Because the other zero word that we all know and fear is 0 day, right? And so if you take that zero trust model to your applications using merge-based runtime protection and harden them all down, and then a new vulnerability pops up with a library or a function that you weren't using, well, guess what? You're not vulnerable to it because you took that least privileged attitude, right?
Yeah. You remove those things. Exactly. Yeah. Attack surface reduction.
Yep. And the same applies to your operating system. The same applies to almost anything. You want to make sure that you've given the minimum privileges necessary or the minimum functionality necessary for the job at hand to function.
Absolutely.
Good. All right, Shannon, thank you for that very good feedback. All right, so do we have any, I see some chat.
I think
actually, go ahead.
Oh, we're all up to date on the chat right now.
Okay, all right. Good. All right, so then moving forward, new capabilities. Clearly, if you're going to go on this zero trust journey, which is going to take there's quite a bit of detail involved in planning and execution. So it is a multi-year process, not a multi-week process, most likely for most organizations. But there is this need for kind of a unified authentication mechanism, this need for a centralized authorization mechanism, this need to grab device information, this need for potentially new SOC capabilities, updated training, internal roles and responsibilities in terms of who oversees authentication, authorization, etc. The reason I bring this up is because authentication in the past was usually I'm logging into my workstation, I need my username and password. It was an IT function. Now authentication and identity is becoming really a security control. So one of the things I'm seeing is actually it could be in the past that identity was owned by IT. It's now identity might be owned by security. So security actually becomes an active participant in the day-to-day running of systems, which is kind of a change of what we might have had in the past. Updated policies and updated governance. So clearly, almost every part of security needs to be changed in order to kind of go down this zero trust path. And each one of these topics we could talk about for hours and hours and hours and just scratch the surface. It's a very
it sounds expensive, honestly. The zero trust is not zero cost, is
it? Right. Well, the answer to that, if I ask that question at the vendor booth at Black Hat, somebody would say, "How much do your breaches cost you?" or something like that.
How much is your reputation worth? Yeah.
Exactly. And these are things that you can't really, I don't know that there's like open source or freely available identity providers you can go and grab. It doesn't exist. So there's definitely cost involved. All right. So what are the implications for application security? Some of these have already been mentioned, Shannon and others, but identity is a pretty big implication for application security. We talked about that with the testing environments. Internally facing applications may now be externally facing, right? You have an internal, let's say, approval system that may need to go external. And part of that might be if you start getting rid of your VPN, a lot of these internal systems need to be accessed externally. And there are mechanisms to do that. I don't want to get into specific vendors and so forth, but there are ways that you can access particular externally facing resources, but greatly restrict who can get to them and how they can be accessed.
I mean, on the application security side, one thing I think about, let me know if is it covered well in zero trust literature, is right, like the one thing that's sort of implicitly trusted, right? And zero trust seems to be about questioning your assumptions about trust. And so something that is very powerfully implicitly trusted these days is libraries, open source libraries, right? Mm-hmm. Like if it's in Maven Central, if it's in the NPM registry, if it's in the PyPy registry, it's good.
Let's use it.
Yeah, let's just bring it down. And if it itself has 8 dependencies that it needs to bring down, that's fine. And if those 8 dependencies have another 62 dependencies, that's fine, right? And so so you will, that, I mean, so I'm just curious, in the zero trust literature, is there much attention paid towards that? Because that is a really powerful implicitly trusted area right now in terms of software and application security.
So zero trust really, if you read the documentation, it's really like a network strategy, a network security strategy. It doesn't get into like applications, but we can take elements of it and apply it in the application development process. But there's probably in the future, somebody will put a whole bunch of really good application security type axioms together and give it a really cool title, and then that will make it into a presidential executive order in the future, right?
And I guess, I mean, the president, it's interesting that the presidential order explicitly references zero trust and explicitly references software supply chain. So, I mean, in a way, if software supply chain was already baked into zero trust, why would they reference both?
Yeah, it's not, right? Yeah, as far as I understand it, I haven't read many application or really, so I mean, the tangential things are here, right? Identity, secure connections, etc. But zero trust doesn't get into the architecture or development or, SDLC or any other kind of recommendations or best practices for application development. But, we've got other documents, I guess the OWASP top 10 and, other, secure coding guidelines and things like that we use for those cases. But the idea of least privilege, the idea of, I think really the idea of least privilege kind of runs the gamut in terms of, application within application security. And then going back to your library issue, we do have an implicit trust. That's a really good point, Julius. I love that. So there is this implicit trust that we have. I don't have that implicit trust. You don't have that implicit trust. I mean, that's something that is definitely front and foremost on our radars, because we know that anybody can take a library and put it up into PyPy or whatever, or, the equivalent in Java, the equivalent in, NuGet and .NET, whatever.
Exactly.
And then people search for it and download it. And it's the equivalent of downloading an executable and running it on your workstation.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Yeah, you can, that's a problem, right? We
It
need
is.
zero trust for the development environments, for the development world.
You're in a really interesting position, right? Because you actually came from AppSec, and you started out in SAST, in static application security testing, where you actually take libraries and software systems, scan them, find insecure moments in the code, right? And now you've really, in terms of your career trajectory, you take a much broader view of security as a whole across an organization. And just curious, if you kind of bring you back to your roots there, what would be your take, is there any hope for the software supply chain and these dependency graphs and these libraries? Kind of like if you take these perspectives that you've had over the course of your career.
So this issue, even before security, I was a developer, and I worked at a little company that you might have heard of before called Lehman Brothers. Right. So back before the first, like the previous financial crash that we had in 2007, I was at Lehman Brothers, and I was a developer there. And in order for me to use a third-party library on a production system, I had to clear it with the security team, right?
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't a free-for-all back then. Everything had to be approved, and I guess that they did some analysis of the library to decide if it was, if I wanted to use log4j, I had to check with them and say, is this okay to use or not? So
it's almost like we need to come full circle. Like we need to come back to that somehow.
We might have to go back to that. I think what happened was at a certain point, the security team said, we have no idea how to evaluate the security of these particular libraries, which was one of the reasons I got into things like static code analysis and so forth, to see if programmatically we could analyze third-party libraries and applications and find vulnerabilities. But we might have to go back to that. But the problem is, how fast third-party libraries iterate and what a wide variety of third-party libraries developers want to use. So that puts a huge burden on the security team to evaluate that. But at the same time, if these types of issues like log4j and so forth continue, then you could make a benefit analysis saying the juice is worth the squeeze, right? Yeah. We need to make this evaluation, even if it slows down development, because the risk is too high. But I think most security teams right now, that's not front and foremost on their radar.
We actually have to wrap up now. So I've gone and made us go a little bit over time. So my apologies, everyone, for that. If people have to run away now, I totally understand.
Let me just say one last thing before everybody leaves. Memorandum 22-18 is the last of your reading assignments. So this is a memorandum within for federal agencies, but it does detail specifically application security related activities and security controls that need to be implemented in order to sell to the federal government or for the federal government to use that software. And that is going to have a ripple effect across all of application security. So we might have to do another presentation in the future, Julius, to wrap that up, but that's the final thing.
Okay, Jerry, again, this was awesome having you here. Just really love bringing your experience, your wisdom, your perspective. It's such a different, more broader perspective than I get to see way down in the trenches here of the library problem. And yeah, just so grateful to have you here today. That was awesome, Jerry. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Pleasure was all mine. And thank you to all the participants and all the wonderful conversation. And have a wonderful rest of the day.
Yeah, great session, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.